Chapter 5. Unraveling the Truth. Detective Alex Reed sat in his car, staring at the rain-soaked windshield as the rhythmic tapping of the raindrops mirrored the tension in his mind. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they didn't form a picture that Reed was ready to accept, not yet. Elise Harper's disappearance had taken him down a dark path, one full of lies, betrayals, and a family secret that seemed to be far more sinister than he initially suspected. Reed rubbed his temples, willing the headache that had been building to fade. His conversation with Robert Harper earlier had left him with more questions than answers. The old man's guilt-ridden eyes and reluctant confession about the family's connection to an art forgery ring still echoed in Reed's thoughts. Robert had tried to protect Elise, but in doing so, had only driven her deeper into the secrets of the past. It was time to confront the truth head-on. Reed made up his mind to head back to the Harper mansion. There was something there, hidden in the shadows of the family's legacy, that Elise had been on the verge of discovering, and Reed had every intention of finding it. The Harper mansion loomed ahead as Reed pulled up to the grand iron gates. The house itself was old, Gothic, and imposing, with ivy crawling up its stone walls like veins, as though the building itself was alive and breathing. A shiver ran down Reed's spine as he approached the front door, the eerie silence of the mansion amplifying the tension in the air. Margaret, the housekeeper, greeted him at the door. She was pale and tired, her eyes red as if she had been crying. "Detective Reed," she said in a hushed voice, "Mr. Harper has been restless since you left. He's been pacing in his study, mumbling about the past." "I need to speak with him again," Reed replied, stepping inside. "It's important." Margaret nodded, but before leading him toward the study, she hesitated. "Detective, there's something you should know. I've worked for the Harper family for decades, and I've seen things I wasn't meant to see. There were rumors about Mr. Harper's father, the original Robert Harper. They say he made his fortune through less than legal means, and some of that fortune, well, it wasn't earned honestly." "What are you getting at, Margaret?" Reed asked, his brow furrowed. "Elise found something from her grandfather's past," Margaret said quietly. "She was going through old ledgers and letters hidden in the attic. She mentioned a painting, a rare one, but she wouldn't tell me much more than that. Whatever she found, it frightened her." Reed nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "Thank you, Margaret. That's helpful." He went down the dimly lit hallway toward Robert's study, his mind racing with possibilities. The secrets of the Harper family were finally starting to come into focus, but what would he find when the truth was fully revealed? Reed entered the study to find Robert Harper sitting at his desk, staring blankly at an old ledger that had been laid out in front of him. He looked up as Reed approached, his eyes filled with weariness and something else, perhaps regret. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon, Detective," Robert said quietly. "What more could you want from me?" "I want the truth, Robert," Reed said, stepping closer. "Margaret told me Elise found something in the attic, old letters, ledgers, and a painting. What is it that your family has been hiding all these years?" Robert sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I didn't want Elise to go down that road. I didn't want her to suffer because of the mistakes of her grandfather. But she was stubborn, determined to uncover the past no matter the cost." "What did she find?" Reed pressed, his voice firm but not unkind. "There was a painting," Robert began, his voice faltering slightly. "A masterpiece by an artist whose works were thought to be lost forever. My father was involved in an art smuggling ring during the war. He acquired stolen paintings, including this one, and passed it off as a legitimate part of our family's collection. It was a secret he took to his grave, or so I thought." Reed leaned in, sensing that he was finally on the verge of a breakthrough. "And Elise discovered the truth?" "Yes," Robert admitted. "She found documents that proved the painting was stolen. She wanted to expose it, to return it to its rightful owner, but I was afraid of what that would mean for our family's reputation. I tried to stop her, but Elise wasn't easily dissuaded. She believed in doing the right thing, no matter the consequences." Reed's mind was racing. "Do you know where the painting is now?" Robert hesitated for a moment before nodding. "It's hidden in the vault downstairs. I never intended for anyone to find it, but it's there." Reed stood, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. Show me. The vault was hidden behind a false wall in the basement of the mansion. Robert Harper led Reed down a narrow staircase into the darkened lower levels of the house, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The air was cold and damp, and the tension between the two men was palpable. Robert stopped in front of a large steel door, fumbling with a set of keys before unlocking it. The door creaked open to reveal a small, dimly lit room filled with old crates and dusty artifacts. In the center of the room, draped in a sheet, was the painting. Reed stepped forward and carefully pulled back the sheet. His breath caught in his throat as he gazed at the masterpiece before him. The painting was exquisite, an oil on canvas vibrant yet haunting. It depicted a serene landscape with a single figure standing on a hill, looking out at a stormy sky. The brushstrokes were unmistakable. This was the work of a master. "This is it," Robert said softly, his voice filled with both awe and shame. "The painting that started it all. Elise wanted to return it, to clear our family's name. But I was afraid of what would happen if the world knew the truth." Reed studied the painting for a moment longer before turning to Robert. "Where is Elise now? Do you know who took her?" Robert shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. She disappeared after our last conversation. I begged her to leave it alone, but she wouldn't listen. Someone else must have known what she was planning. Someone who didn't want the painting to be exposed." Just then, Reed's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and answered, his heart racing. It was Sergeant Mills. "Reed, we've got a break," Mills said urgently. "We found a location connected to Charles Blackwood, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. We think that's where Elise is being held." Reed's pulse quickened. "I'm on my way." He turned to Robert, his expression grim. "This isn't over yet. Stay here and wait for my call." Without waiting for a response, Reed rushed out of the mansion and into the night, focusing on saving Elise Harper before it was too late. The truth had been unraveled, but the danger was far from over. As Reed raced toward the warehouse, he knew the final confrontation was looming. The past had come back to haunt them all, and the echoes of that past were about to reach their deafening crescendo. Chapter 6: The Final Confrontation. Detective Alex Reed drove through the rainy streets of Ravenwood, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows across the slick pavement. His heart raced with anticipation, knowing that he was finally closing in on the truth, and on Elise Harper. Sergeant Mills had provided the crucial lead. An old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, tied to Charles Blackwood, the enigmatic art collector at the center of the web of deceit. Blackwood was a man of influence and wealth, accustomed to controlling his world from the shadows. But now, his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. If Elise was still alive, Reed knew he didn't have much time. The warehouse loomed ahead as Reed turned down a deserted road, its rusted metal structure barely visible through the thick fog. He killed the engine and stepped out of the car, moving cautiously toward the building. The cold air bit at his skin, but Reed barely noticed. His mind was focused entirely on what lay ahead. The warehouse door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Reed slipped inside, drawing his gun as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The interior was vast and eerily quiet, filled with old crates and debris that hinted at the building's past as a storage facility for illicit goods. Somewhere within, Elise was waiting. He could feel it. As he crept further into the building, Reed's senses were on high alert. Every sound, every movement, sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. He passed rows of stacked crates, each one casting long, distorted shadows. The warehouse felt like a maze, a labyrinth designed to trap its prey. But Reed had come too far to turn back now. Suddenly, he heard muffled voices echoing through the stillness. He crouched behind a stack of crates, listening intently. The voices were coming from a small room at the far end of the warehouse. He could make out two distinct figures. One of them was unmistakably Charles Blackwood, his smooth, sinister tone dripping with confidence. The other voice was rougher, unfamiliar. Reed inched closer, keeping low as he moved between the crates. As he approached the room, the voices grew louder, and soon he could make out their conversation. "She was a fool to think she could expose us," Blackwood was saying. "I told you we had nothing to fear. Once we're finished here, No one will ever find her. Are you sure about this? The rough-voiced man asked. There's been too much heat. The detective is getting close. Reed's heart pounded in his chest. He was close now. He could sense Elise was just beyond the door. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no time for hesitation. Reed burst through the door, gun drawn. Police. Hands where I can see them. The scene inside was exactly what Reed had feared. Elise Harper was tied to a chair in the center of the room, her face pale but determined, her eyes wide with shock as Reed stormed in. Charles Blackwood stood next to her, his expression momentarily frozen in disbelief. The other man, a burly thug with a scar running down his cheek, reached for his weapon, but Reed was quicker. Don't even think about it, Reed growled, his gun trained on the thug. Hands in the air now. The thug hesitated for a moment, but finally complied, raising his hands as he glared at Reed. Blackwood, however, remained calm, his eyes narrowing as he slowly raised his hands. This is a mistake, detective, Blackwood said, his voice as smooth as ever. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing, Reed snapped, keeping his gun steady. This ends now, Blackwood. You're finished. Reed took a step forward, glancing briefly at Elise to make sure she was unharmed. Her eyes locked onto his, and he could see the relief mixed with fear in her gaze. She had been through hell, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered for now. You've got nothing on me, Blackwood sneered. Even if you arrest me, do you really think my connections will let me rot in a cell? You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. Reed felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew Blackwood was trying to rattle him, to make him second-guess himself. But Reed had faced men like Blackwood before, men who thought they were untouchable because of their power and influence. Reed wasn't going to let him win. Your game is over, Reed said coldly. I've got enough evidence to bury you, and if you think your money and connections will save you, you're dead wrong. The art world's dirty secrets are about to come crashing down, and you'll be right at the center of it. Blackwood's face darkened, and for the first time, Reed saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. The thug shifted uneasily, his gaze darting toward the door as if contemplating making a run for it, but Reed stepped closer, tightening his grip on his gun. Don't even try it, Reed warned, his voice deadly. You make one wrong move, and I'll drop you where you stand. Blackwood's lips curled into a sneer, but he remained still, realizing he had no way out. Reed reached into his pocket and pulled out his handcuffs. Blackwood, you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and illegal art trafficking. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Blackwood's sneer faded, replaced by a bitter scowl. He said nothing as Reed cuffed him and motioned for him to sit in the corner. The thug complied as well, and Reed quickly called for backup, securing the scene. Once Blackwood and his thug were restrained, Reed turned his full attention to Elise. He knelt beside her, his expression softening as he untied the ropes that bound her to the chair. Elise, Reed said gently, it's over. You're safe now. Elise's hands trembled as she reached out to him, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. I didn't think anyone would find me, she whispered, her voice cracking. I thought. Reed placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I promised I'd find you, and I keep my promises. Elise nodded, blinking back tears. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for saving me. Reed helped her to her feet, steadying her as she regained her balance. She was shaken but strong, and Reed could see the determination in her eyes. Despite everything she had been through, she hadn't given up. She had fought for the truth, and now, with Blackwood in custody, that truth would finally come to light. As Reed led Elise out of the warehouse and into the cold night air, the distant sound of sirens echoed through the fog. Backup was on the way, and soon the nightmare would be over. But as Reed looked out over the darkened city of Ravenwood, he couldn't help but wonder how many more secrets lay buried in its shadows. How many more powerful men like Blackwood were out there, waiting to be exposed. For now, though, Reed had done his job. Elise Harper was safe, the truth had been uncovered, and justice would be served. But in a city like Ravenwood, Reed knew, the echoes of the past were never truly silent. Chapter 7, Echoes of the Past. The rain had stopped by the time Detective Alex Reed stepped out of the police station, the heavy clouds parting just enough to let the pale moonlight illuminate the wet streets of Ravenwood. It had been a long night of paperwork, statements, and briefings with his superiors, but the case was finally over. Blackwood was in custody, and Elise Harper had been reunited with her father. The ordeal that had started with a mysterious disappearance had led to an unraveling of dark secrets, but justice, it seemed, had finally been served. Reed leaned against his car, feeling the cool breeze against his skin. The city was quieter now, almost peaceful, but Reed knew better. Ravenwood had always been a city of shadows, its beauty marred by corruption, its history stained with crimes that had gone unpunished for decades. It was a city where power and money could bury the truth, where secrets lingered like ghosts waiting to be discovered. The truth was never simple, never clean. As Reed stood there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He fished it out and saw a message from Elise. It was short but heartfelt. "Thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you. Dinner soon. I owe you more than words can say." Reed smiled faintly, texting back a quick reply before pocketing his phone. Elise had been through hell, but she was stronger than most people gave her credit for. She had uncovered the truth about her family, stood up to Blackwood, and faced her fears head-on. And despite everything, she hadn't broken. Reed admired that. But even though the case was technically closed, Reed couldn't shake the feeling that there was more lurking beneath the surface. Blackwood was a powerful man with deep connections in the art world, and while his arrest would send ripples through that world, Reed doubted it would be enough to stop the darker undercurrents entirely. Someone else would step into Blackwood's place. There was always someone waiting in the wings, ready to exploit greed, power, and influence. As Reed got into his car and started the engine, he thought back to his conversation with Elise earlier that night, after the police had taken Blackwood away. She had told him about the painting, the one that had sparked everything, the stolen masterpiece hidden in the Harper family vault. It was a work of art with a history stained by war, corruption, and greed, and now it would be returned to its rightful owners. That much was certain. But Reed couldn't help wondering what other stolen treasures were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. He drove in silence for a while, the city's streets empty at this late hour. His mind kept circling back to Blackwood's final words during the interrogation. "You think you've won, detective," Blackwood had said with a smug smile, despite the handcuffs biting into his wrists. "But you've only scratched the surface. This world is bigger than you could ever imagine. You don't know how deep it goes." Reed had brushed it off at the time, as the last desperate boast of a man, trying to maintain control over a situation that had slipped from his grasp. But now, alone in the quiet of the night, the words echoed in Reed's mind, leaving him with an uneasy feeling. He had uncovered a major criminal operation, but he couldn't shake the thought that Blackwood had been right. There was more out there. And one case couldn't clean up an entire industry built on lies, manipulation, and crime. The next day, Reed found himself back at the Harper mansion. The rain had washed away some of the grime and tension from the night before, but the air was still thick with the weight of history. Reed stood outside the mansion for a moment, taking it in, its grand, imposing structure a symbol of the power and privilege the Harper family had long enjoyed. But now, with the truth exposed, it felt different. Less imposing, more fragile. Elise greeted him at the door, her face showing signs of exhaustion, but there was a warmth in her smile that hadn't been there before. She led him inside, and they walked together to the study where Robert Harper sat, looking weary but relieved. "Detective Reed," Robert said, standing as they entered, "I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for bringing my daughter back to me." Reed nodded. "Just doing my job, Mr. Harper." Robert motioned for Reed to sit, and the three of them settled into the room. The tension that had once filled the house seemed to have lifted, but there was still an air of uncertainty, of unfinished business. "I understand you're returning the painting to its rightful owners," Reed said after a moment of silence. Robert nodded slowly. "It's the right thing to do. My father made terrible choices I never fully understood until Elise uncovered the truth. That painting is a symbol of all the wrongs that were done. Returning it won't undo the past, but it's a start." Reed leaned back in his chair, studying Robert for a moment. The man had been complicit, even if unintentionally, in keeping his father's dark legacy hidden. But Reed could see that he was trying to make amends. And Blackwood? Reed asked. He wasn't working alone, was he? Robert shook his head, his expression grim. No. There are others, wealthy collectors, corrupt dealers, people with influence in the highest places. Blackwood was just one player in a much larger game. I'm afraid that even with him behind bars, the art world will continue to operate in the shadows. Reed sighed. He had expected as much. Blackwood's arrest was a victory, but it wouldn't be enough to bring down the entire operation. Still, it was a step in the right direction, a small crack in the armor of a corrupt system. Elise spoke up then, her voice steady but laced with emotion. I've decided to write about everything that happened. The stolen art, the secrets, Blackwood's operation. People need to know the truth. Even if it's just a small piece of the puzzle, it's important to shine a light on it. Reed nodded, impressed by her determination. It's a good idea. The more people know, the harder it'll be for people like Blackwood to operate in the shadows. For a moment, the three of them sat in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Then Elise stood and walked over to the window, gazing out at the sprawling estate. This house, it's been in our family for generations, she said softly. But now, all I see are the secrets it kept, the lies that were hidden behind these walls. Robert stood as well, walking over to join her. We'll rebuild, he said quietly. Not just the house, but our legacy. We'll make it something we can be proud of. Reed watched them for a moment, feeling a sense of closure. The Harper family had been through a lot, but they were taking steps to make things right. And while the shadows of the past would always linger, the future held the possibility of something better. As Reed left the mansion and made his way back to his car, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. The case was over, and justice had been served. But more than that, Reed had learned something important, something about the nature of truth and the power of persistence. In a city like Ravenwood, the shadows would always be there, lurking just beyond the light. But as long as people were willing to stand up and fight for the truth, the darkness could never fully win. Reed climbed into his car and started the engine, the familiar hum comforting him as he pulled away from the Harper mansion. He didn't know what the future held, but for now he was content. The echoes of the past had finally faded, leaving behind a quiet calm. But Reed knew deep down that Ravenwood's secrets were never truly buried. The city still had more stories to tell, and when the time came, he would be ready to face them once again. For now, though, the case was closed, and that was enough.